I think we are live. Well, appreciate everybody coming out. We've had a few public sector talks this year, and we're pretty excited about this one in particular. Today, I have joining me Leo Garciga. He is the CTO over JIDO. My name is Henry Sowell. I am the CIO of Hortonworks Federal. We do solutions for all of public sector. This guy helps defeat improvised threats on the battlefield and overseas. So we have a really interesting talk today about how do we leverage Hadoop to defend against improvised threats. I take this very personally, this topic. That's me, much younger and way more fit than I am now. In 2005, I was in Iraq, landed on the ground, and almost immediately we were encountering various improvised threats, IEDs, tank rounds, mines, all kinds of devices that people were setting up, and they were becoming even more and more skilled in the ways in which they would use these devices, and so this is one of our early attacks that we got. Our vehicle hit a double-stacked mine. Luckily, we were an up-armored vehicle, and the only injury was my gunner, who had a very pretty smile, was missing a front tooth. But you know, that's pretty good for that kind of attack. And so we were dealing with all of these threats, and then came a very hard day. And Mother's Day 2005 started the Battle of Al-Qaim, also known as Operation Matador. Very intense battle, fighting. They estimated probably around 300 AQI fighters in the Al Anbar province. By the third day, everything had quieted down. We were facing little to no resistance, and two vehicles drove around a corner, no problem. One was actually carrying a famous actor, I can't remember his name. He totally lucked out. But this vehicle right here, which that's what it looks like before it hits an explosive, carrying anywhere from 15 to 20 individuals, hit an IED that had been buried under the ground. It was an aircraft bomb that had a pressure plate attached to it. So when the weight of this vehicle went over, blew up under the compartment of the vehicle, immediately killed 5. I was one of the first on the scene, pulled out another 13 that were in various conditions, worked on. I was personally working on one, and he passed away, and it was very, very difficult scene. These are the kind of things that our troops face on a regular basis, the threats that are actively used against them. Beyond that, they're also used in civilian communities against many different kinds of targets. And it is quite upsetting to personally go through one of these events. Fast forward to 2010. By that point, I had joined the FBI. I was working in the counterterrorism division, and we had one of these explosives device get set off, killed 3 Americans, killed a number of other indigenous folks that were in the same area, and we started investigating it. We were able to start getting certain types of traffic that, to a human doesn't mean much, machine data. But we knew that there was something very important that we could extract out of that machine data. We developed a social networking algorithm. We're able to quickly identify the threats in this network, and it was fantastic because we were able to take down the cell that had placed that bomb. The problem was I was doing it on a desktop, and we talked about it this morning, but doing it on a desktop really isn't effective when you have an enterprise problem. And what we did is we decided let's go run it in the enterprise. Our traditional means of doing this type of analysis, the hardware was incapable of returning a result. After 4 days, we gave up, and we heard about this thing called Hadoop, and we took 4 Mac Pros, networked them together through the same data, finished in 19 minutes. And it changed my life because I had been wanting to solve hard problems and to figure out things that, to start going after our mission. And that's what this, that's what the technology that we're working with on a daily basis allows us to start going and asking hard questions, whether you're in commercial or whether you're in the government space. And one thing that I'm really excited about working with Leo, we met about 2 years ago now, and the work that he's doing is quite amazing. He took a very hard problem, this kind of threat, and how do you combine various sources of data and many things that he may not be able to talk about together, and actually start coming up with a picture that you can start defeating these threats before they actually hurt someone. And when he first started that project, he was using and spending a lot of money doing it, a lot of his own maintenance to make this kinds of thing happen. Through our partnership, was able to take away the side of the business that was focused on maintaining a Hadoop stack and go after the mission and starting to do some amazing things. He's been one of the most innovative CTOs in the DoD, and has done quite amazing things for the mission, not only for his organization, but for many others, very well outspoken in this community. So with that, he's got much more to say on that topic. I'm going to hand it over. Leo?
Thanks, Henry. Thanks for your service, too. So really quick, I have to do the obligatory, this is where I'm from, this is who I am. Leo Garciga, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the Joint-Improvised-Threat Defeat organization. And I think for everybody here, here's the important thing to know. Right? We're an organization that was set up to do some very specific things, which is really get capability out to the warfighter in less than 2 years. I know that's a shocking idea for folks in the commercial space, right? Less than 2 years, you should be doing that anyways, right? Well, DoD's a little bit challenging, right? Takes some time to get stuff on the street and out to the warfighter. But our focus has always been on looking at those gaps that are out there and getting capability out. Big thing, and Henry hit on it, we've been working in the big data space for a while now, since about 2013, with some iterations over time, and I'll get into that. But I think the big takeaway here is, organizationally, we're set up to really go after those quick fights that are out there to get capability out. That being said, I will now put my disclaimer that everything you're going to see after this is Leo Garciga's personal opinion and not necessarily those of the Department of Defense. General Counsel will be super happy with me now. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about big data. I think a little bit of a different way than I hear most people talk, right? We usually go right into architecture, and this is a cool problem we're solving. But I want to take a step back from that, and I want to talk a little bit about ecosystem, right? And having that ecosystem to support these big data platforms. Because here's my big lesson learned over the last couple of years. Number one, functionals are really good at understanding what their problem set is. I'm sure those of you who are working in different spaces know that. They know how to answer their question. They know the question they want to answer. IT people, not so much, right? We're kind of just doing stuff. So how do you better engage with them? We spent a lot of time really focused on getting our folks, right, whether it be data scientists or big data SMEs, sitting out at the edge with our customers to really understand what those problems are. So that's the first thing. I think the second bigger thing is infrastructure, right? I've heard a couple of people talk today and talk about this great problem, which is modernization, right? So when we look at a lot of enterprises, still a lot of legacy stuff running, and we want to make this massive leap, right? And say, hey, we're going to do all this great stuff. We're going to use all this new technology, but we still got to deal with this, and we're just going to do it in one shot. I don't think that's real. That's been my experience, right? It takes a little bit of time. There's some halfway points to get through to get to where you're going, but it is something to think about. And obviously getting better at deploying capabilities, right? So democratizing that out as far down as you can to not just, let's say, an analytical person who's looking at a problem or a functional, but down to developers. And I'll talk a little bit about that because Henry convinced me to. And I think the other piece is really building those partnerships at the analytic layer, right? So for us, I don't own everything in the Department of Defense, right? I own one little piece that I can deploy, but a lot of it is integrating that with a bunch of other big data capabilities and data capabilities that are out there. So what does that look like, right? Architecturally, that's an interesting problem set. I think we talked a lot during the keynote. We were talking about, how do you do the hybrid cloud thing and how do you go from on-prem to off-prem? So we see that problem a lot, and that's still a continuing problem within the DoD space. But I think having that ecosystem that really gets from the very edge of where your customer is to build and develop capabilities and stop worrying about the infrastructure piece, right? Like really automating that so it's not a problem is pretty key. That being said, kind of did some slide swapping. I wanted to talk a little bit about some challenges before I get to kind of where we are right now in the federal space. How many folks here are supporting a federal customer or have worked in federal government? Oh, this is an outstanding audience. So I'm going to get some chuckles with some of the stuff. How many folks are just purely on the commercial side? Even better. Anybody in finance? Healthcare? All right, that was a poll on the fly. That's good. So a couple things, right? So I just talked about infrastructure, super huge. Then think about the DoD challenge, right? So working across multiple enclaves with multiple restrictions on those enclaves, not publicly available in the cloud. Well, that's a little bit of a challenge, right? So we're almost hampered from going to some of those places. So that situation is getting better. I think the big thing to take away, though, which is my favorite part, is the acquisition system in DoD. So I can go right now and get some space on AWS in about 15 minutes and be up and running and spin something up, right? I mean, pretty much everybody in this room can do that. We can't do that in DoD. That could be a 2-year process sometimes. So just think about that challenge, right? This is just to get the start. But that still continues to be a challenge. I'll hit one on software, which is really interesting. This is really where we need help from the open source community, is really understanding what some of our requirements are. As we go in, right, and it's bi-directional. I think Henry and I just talked about that before I came on stage, about some work that we're doing that we're thinking about open sourcing, because it just makes sense, right, to contribute that back. But really going out there and finding those things, because what we're finding more often than not is that the capabilities that are out there, right? And not to pick on Docker, but I will. Images that are getting put out there, there's a lot of bad code in there and a lot of vulnerabilities, right? Which means a lot of work for me on the development side to go fix that, right? So that's part of what does that engagement look like in the future. I think it's really important to think about, because it's different than the traditional DoD model where we pay some large integrator, they go figure it out for us, they charge us a lot of money, and we maybe get something. On the data side, super interesting problem set there too. Guess what? Like I said, I don't own the entire DoD enterprise, right? So I've got everything to deal with, right? I got people that put awesome data in Excel spreadsheets and post it on SharePoint, and they call that a database. If anybody's having that in the commercial space, please let me know, because that's insane to me. But that's really what happens all the time. I got some folks here from our ORSA folks. How many spreadsheets do we get a week? A lot, right? It's ridiculous. We counted something like 1,000 spreadsheets that we brought in a month into our data lake, which is insane, right? Because a lot of the data is being created that way. And the last piece, right? I won't harp on this too much. There's a human capital challenge. One, it's really hard to bring folks into civil service, and it's really hard to keep them in civil service if they have skill sets. So that's really where I've been kind of going around and really talking to industry in the commercial space and thinking about how do we build a more of a Manhattan Project-like system where we're going from academia to commercial to federal and back to commercial to really get that skill set in. I will tell you, I think Henry said it perfect, right? We're talking about these capabilities and how important they are to get after the fight and to save people's lives. This is real. It is a national security imperative, right? That we maintain those skills, and it can't just be on the commercial side. It's really got to be across the industrial base, right? To be able to support those core capabilities that the nation is using in the national security fight. All right, I did a DoD talking point. I get 5 points for that. All right, JIDO's big data architecture. So I'm going to talk a little bit, a story more than anything else, about kind of our journey, because I think it's the important piece is to kind of walk through that, right? And how we went from a very glued together system to HTTP and kind of where we're at now. This is pretty reflective of, from a technology perspective, what we have in our stack right now. And it's been an interesting journey, right? So sometime in 2013, I don't remember exactly when, we said, hey, we're going to do this. Why? I won't pick on Oracle, but I will. So we had this huge Oracle database. There was something like 400 different data feeds out there, and I spent all of my time managing those data feeds. What does that mean? Well, no capability gets built on top of that data, right? So the warfighter isn't getting capability, no tools are being created, that data is not getting exposed. So we were really looking for what's that next step to take. So we started our Hadoop journey then, and for those who are doing a POC, our first POC, we failed miserably. It was terrible, right? We couldn't get the stack running. It was the worst thing ever. So we regrouped and started again. And that really led to the very beginning of the system we call Catapult from an architecture perspective. And there was some iterations, right? So it took a good 3 years for us to be fully up and running across a bunch of data landscapes, which is a good term for that, or mission enclaves. But some things that we did learn that are important. When we first started, right, there was no Hortonworks. There was no their competitors. Nobody existed in this space. So really, we were cobbling up open source capabilities and building all this glue to hold it together. And it worked, right? But guess where all my operations and maintenance dollars went? They went to that problem set, right? So within about 36 months of operationalizing this capability, we went back to where we were before, right? We were spending all our time on just keeping the system up and keeping the glue and holding it together than actually doing the innovative stuff that the warfighter is asking us to do. Which really turned us on by then, right? You had HTTP, you had some stuff from Cloudera, you had a couple other folks out there that really had worked that glue together, and we made that transition. I think Henry said it perfect, right? What it really was about was getting that off of our plate so we could focus on the core mission stuff around that. So I think most of you, if you've got a stack, you're pretty familiar with this. Again, these technologies are very focused on our problem set, right? Which is really text data. And that's an important piece, right? So I talk a lot to folks, especially in the federal government, who are trying to spin up a Hadoop platform in their organizations. And I always ask the same first question. What problem are you trying to solve, right? So solving a video analytics problem is fundamentally different than solving a text problem, which is fundamentally different than solving a signals type problem or sensor problem. So we've pretty much chosen technologies that are focused around our problem set, which really is that text piece right there and manipulating that text. I will say one thing that's really important in this. I think everything to the right of processing pipeline and tool connections is kind of standard when you're talking about things like search, dynamic search, and presenting some of this data. I think where we've spent a lot of time, just from a mission perspective, has been very much on the ingest side, where we're doing some non-traditional approaches to bring data in. And again, right, there's capabilities out there, NiFi, there's a bunch of stuff in the open source community too that we could be using. We've made a conscious decision, and why? And the why part's the really important piece. From the beginning in our journey, there was one fundamental requirement, which was we had to be fast at bringing data in, right? New data sets that we'd never seen before, because warfighter is ingenious at putting data in ways that are hard to get at. And once we'd seen it, we had to be able to permanently get at it. And the other piece of that is we had to have the flexibility to do as much processing inside that pipeline and not force it into some model downstream. So it's a little bit of a different approach, but definitely we've been pretty successful at doing it to now. But we are finding out the limits of that approach, most definitely, when you start talking across domains. So for those in the commercial side, right, think about taking like train data. So I'm going to work with a bunch of train data, and I'm going to smash that up with HR data. Well, that's interesting, and there's different ways to deal with that. And that's kind of where we are right now, where we're starting to look at a new, larger threat outside of the IED space. And those problems are starting to arise, where you have multi-domain problems with large veracity of data. So something to think about. If anybody has any ideas, please let me know. I did want to put up here this piece, right? So when we talk about text data, we take in about 1,001 feeds today. That number changes all the time. At about 124.1 million records across a bunch of networks, and they get pushed all over the place. I would say that these feeds are pretty looking. They're terrible, right? It's mostly unstructured and semi-structured data. It's stuff written on, it's ugly, right? So it's not that nice data that we're getting from a structured database that's a lot easier to manage and build analytics on top. There's a lot of work or a lot of time that we've spent working on that piece right there, which is, right, whether you're leveraging some machine learning algorithm or where you're doing more traditional statistical means, getting at the problem to tee that data up and make it more usable. That's an important thing. I know that that's a little number, but I want you to think of it in the term of text, right? Which is a little bit different than most of the things I see out there. I see people with like, we've got 10,000 feeds. Yeah, they're IoT sensors. That's awesome. It's good data, right? We've got 1,000 feeds of effectively garbage data, right, in all kinds of formats. Some of it's interesting and some of it's structured, kind of. But for the most part, it's all different. But I think the bigger piece to that is the veracity piece across one-end domains, right? So it is all very different. So just think through that problem because it's a fun problem to think through. OK. So I talked really fast through a big data stack because I really want to get to questions because that's what I like to do. But I do want to talk about the modernization stuff I hit in the beginning. Here's some interesting things we found out. Number one, so we spent all this time building this architecture that's really flexible and really easy to use. You can just drop stuff in it and build stuff on top of it. And we're not as worried about the data part, but we still have the same infrastructure deployment problems. Right? So one of the things we set off about it 18 months ago was like, yeah, we're gonna drink the DevOps Kool-Aid, right? We're gonna fully automate everything, and we're gonna push this down to the lowest level and get our engineers out of the way. That was a great idea. We did that. Here's the problem with doing that. We didn't get all of our engineers out of the way, right? We still had core infrastructure stuff that we had to deal with. Henry actually asked me to brief this here, by the way. But this is really important when you talk about maintaining and building these stacks, right? So I've heard a lot of people throughout the conference, and a couple of groups I've been in, talk about this. And they always miss this little piece. And it's a little nuanced, right? Especially in the DevOps world. You still have to deal with infrastructure, right? That doesn't go away. Awesome that you put a container in production. Too bad that it's not addressed to any IP and it's not going to the customer. Who cares at that point? Or a firewall port wasn't open. So we spent quite a bit of time working that piece and building some automation into that, right? So this really gets to the SRE part of DevOps. I don't want to say that too loud. But getting to the harder things to do. So if you're in the federal space, right, one of those things is, hey, I need to have all my NIST cybersecurity framework documentation ready to go on the fly as I deploy capability. Bake that in, right? I think the other one is those automated kind of controls that we put on a lot of our systems, baking that in. So what you're not doing is you're not inadvertently delaying deploying these capabilities on the network, i.e., awesome that you're doing DevOps and you got your security engineer there at the beginning, so you've got great software written. Too bad your infrastructure is not secure, right? So how do you bake that into one thing? So we have spent quite a bit of time doing that. A little bit of a different approach, but definitely one that I'm excited about.
I just want to double tap on how significant that is. So, being able to view across the public sector, every time we go to a customer or working on developing a solution, it's, have you addressed DoD STIGs? All right. Where are you on this? Is everything ready to go? And while we can work through that, it is a custom challenge that gets placed at every organization, and it's weeks to months of development, and he's automated that. So every time he has something new, it gets stood up and deployed automatically in 5 minutes. That is not insignificant. And if you've got a new project, you've got to learn and see this one.
And I'll tell you why it's important. I'll give you an example because this happened the other day. I have a tendency, shockingly, to make some smart comments to my people when I see stuff. And I walked over to somebody's desk and I did it would be really cool if, right? That's all I said. I'm like, I think that's a pretty cool idea. So the next day I came in and they're like, hey, it's deployed. And I'm like, what's deployed? And they told me, and I'm like, I was just saying it would be really cool if. I didn't say go do it, right? But the interesting thing about that is, so for those folks in the federal space, think about what I just said. How many months would that take in most organizations? 12, right? 12 months. 8 months if you're lucky. 18 months if you're a service. Nobody got that joke except me. But I think that's important to note, right? And what that really means. And doing these things really gets to, right? If you guys read the papers, you hear about the Department of Defense really, Secretary Mattis focus on how do we get agility into the way that we do business, right? Not just on software development side, but how do we get agility on the way we acquire weapon systems, on the way we push capability out to the warfighter. And some of this starts with some just bare metal infrastructure problems, right? And part of that is modernizing the enterprise to be able to do things like this. And really what it means for the long term is speed and governance too. All right, I'm going to throw this magical eye chart because I said I needed one chart that looks like it came from the Department of Defense. So this is my one eye chart that looks like it came from the Department of Defense. And this really gets to, look, whole new space, right? I think the important thing is if you want to be really fast at getting those capabilities out and building analytics on top of these platforms, right? You really have to just embrace that DevOps culture and embrace the technology behind it. And I know for a lot of enterprises that's scary. Your enterprise people hate you. You're working me out of a job, blah, blah, blah. I hear it all the time. I will tell you this. The really important thing is that you are empowering developers to get closer to, one, their functional customer on how to deploy capability. But more than anything else, and this is an interesting thing that I've found, is I was all excited because I was going to push capability out faster. I'm like, yes, I can commit, and boom, it goes to production. Awesome, greatest day ever, right? The first time that I kind of saw our DevOps dashboard, I had one comment to my team. I'm like, damn, this is more governance than anywhere I've ever seen. Holy cow. I'm like, every CIO out there should be looking at this and saying, why aren't we doing it? Because for the first time, at least in my career, I was able to holistically see code that was written, where it was in its life, right? All the documentation around it, that's crazy, right? How it was deployed, what the next thing that's coming, all in one place. So think about that programmatically and what that looks like. So if you're not a developer, but you're a PM, you care. All right, that being said, because I've talked a lot, I think I want to do some questions, unless you got something, Henry.
One thing I wanted to highlight too is this process, whether you're in commercial or government, it's highly applicable. Look what we're dealing with GDPR, look what we're dealing with in the healthcare industry, look what rules and things that you have to follow in the financial industry. And if you're able to automate those processes, dealing with those policies, get it so that you can stop focusing on those solutions all the time and actually your business's mission, your agency's mission, it's really significant.
Yeah, and I'll go back one even to this, right? So GDPR is a great example, right? For those of us who like listening to some crazy podcasts on cybersecurity, right? And everybody freaking out. And my whole thought was like, hey, we got ways to solve this problem. Right? There's automated capabilities out there that can help you bake that in to the software that you're developing or how you're deploying a database. So it is important to start thinking about what that looks like. And I know we talked a little bit about infrastructure here, and the reason we did, right, it really boils down back to the original premise, which is like, if you want to do this big data stuff and you want to do it well and with some agility, you got to kind of knock out these blocking and tackling problems, right? And the space is moving fast, right? I think, I'll give you an interesting example here. So we went, there's some hash keys for this product, Twistlock, looking inside a container. We went like 24.5 hours, right, away from matching those hashes, and the amount of vulnerabilities we had was insane, right? All of a sudden it jumped up. We were like, holy cow, what's going on, right? And that gets to how fast folks are finding vulnerabilities out there. And an important note, which I will pitch this because this is my bigger national security. Guess what? All this is democratized, right? So the enemy gets a vote on all this. They're moving just as fast as we are, whether it be in the big data space or it be on the DevOps space. There are nation states and there's other bad guys that are out there, nefarious actors that are using this stuff too. So we need to be as fast and as agile as they are, because guess what? They don't have a bunch of regulation that's going to force them to move really slow. All right, now we can go to questions.
Yeah, so guys, I hope you're as excited about the work that Leo and the rest of the JIDO community has done. It's really fantastic, and just to tie back to what I first said, it comes back to real world effects that the warfighter is getting protected. and it's pretty incredible. So congratulations to the work you all have done. Right now, what we'd like to do is just open it up to any questions. So please don't leave us hanging out here, and grab, if you would, we've got 2 mics here.
That wasn't me, that was you.
First of all, thank you for your service
Oh, thanks.
and sharing that personal story. Back on slide 8, you had mentioned non-traditional data acquisition. Is it possible to share some?
What is non-traditional data acquisition? So I would say this, right? So data that's not readily available to stream in, right? So batch data that may be created somewhere, and then you got to bring that in maybe from an external site. And then some other sources, which is a wide range of different sources, a lot of commercially available stuff. Who do you work for? Let me see if I can give you an example.
Blue Cross Blue Shield.
Blue Cross Blue Shield, awesome. So for you, non-traditional sources, is which you're probably collecting on already, is maybe you're releasing some campaign, you're doing some analytics on, let's say, how we're bringing nurses closer to our customer, right? So they can get that care, so they don't have to go into some center, right? So you're monitoring that on Twitter, you're monitoring that on Facebook, and you're bringing those sources in. But maybe you're also paying for some sources from some certain vendors that have access to the data that's getting out there. So that would be a non-traditional source, right? For DoD, I would say that pretty much a lot of the open source would be non-traditional sources, and I would say also kind of fee-for-service type sources that are out there, right? So like the Dun & Bradstreets of the world and stuff like that. That's on the non-traditional side. And then from a more tactical perspective, it gets to the ugly data, right? So it is not unusual for somebody to show up with a hard drive and say, here's all this data. And I'm like, okay, so we'll bring that in. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Nice presentation, thank you. One of the slides you mentioned about data scientists, how they work, and you talked a little bit about security clearance and how long it takes. But specifically, can you talk a little bit at a high level around what kind of processes you've built so data scientists can develop models, put that in production, test it out, and take feedback and improve the models?
So excited about this
How does that work?
question. Yeah, so excited about this question. Great question. We have one of them sitting in the room right now. We've been having this conversation. So here's I'm going to frame this to you in time. So 1, 2, 3, how many years back? A lot of years back, right? We were like, hey, let's figure out how to do this agile thing because we need to get capability out. Okay, we'll go figure that out. Took about 2 years. Then the next thing was, hey, we really got to figure out how to do this big data thing, things like Catapult, stuff like that. Took us about 2 years, right? Then we said, hey, we really got to get this DevOps thing down, right? Because we got to push stuff out. That took us 2 years. That's the time we're in right now. And now the time we're in is the very beginning of what I call the 2-year digital transformation to really be able to leverage data scientists in a much better way. So right now, I'll say that most of the stuff that you see on Catapult right there, a lot of that data science type work is being done off the stack in a very immature way. Because the capabilities are not organic, right? So one of the things that we're pushing really hard is over the next 6 months to really get a full-fledged data science environment, so almost separate and distinct from our dev and from our production environment, to be able to really do some things like training data sets. So if you really want to know, I have some data scientists who have laptops, like really powerful ones, and they're building all kinds of stuff on them, and then we're hand jamming them in. And that's real, right? And that takes time. And that's just me being an honest broker, that we're still very much on the transformation side of that. Where our data scientists are really making money is more on the on-the-fly analytics that they can build, which is really happening on the user end. And that really gets to our model of how we treat our customer and data, right? So 3 different ways. There's one, I'm going to ingest that into a data lake, right? And make that available. Awesome. 2, I'm going to get access to federated data. Actually, I'm going to access your data, but I'm not going to bring it in and ingest it, but I'm going to smash it up with stuff that I already have and give you an answer. And then the third one, my personal favorite, is bring your own data, right? So I'm going to maybe give you some goodness of the stuff that's happening in Catapult and the analytics there, but I'm going to let you triage your data as you bring it to it, and I'm not going to persist it. So think through that problem. this is where I'm definitely not representing DoD with what I'm about to say, but it's important because what I'm seeing is the trend that we've definitely seen over the last, I'd say 12 months, is especially analysts and operations folks, they really want to bring your own data stuff, right? They want us to give them the analytic on the fly, do the bring your own data stuff, get an answer out, and they're going to walk away and do their own thing, right? So I'm going to do the hard lift that they can't get, let's say, their organization to do, or that is a bridge too far because of, let's say, what network they're on, right? So if you're working on a laptop with a SATCOM in some godforsaken place you don't want to be, right, you don't have time to do some huge query, right? You need to bring this data and get an answer back. But working within those three different models is where we're seeing, and a lot of our data science stuff is actually happening on the bring your own data side, which is a lot more browser-based type work. It's interesting. It's an interesting approach. But that is something real. That's the trend that we've been seeing with our customer. Does that answer your question? I wish I would have said, I've got this huge data science environment, but no. It is it's a very hard problem, right? So it gets to, who did I see? I saw ING guys yesterday, and one of the things they were doing is, yeah, we're going to build this VM, and then we're going to port into our production, and then we're going to port back into dev, and I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to do any of that. That violates like I don't know how many things, you know? But just thinking through that, right? At the end of the day is, how do you let a data scientist have an environment with the right tools, infrastructure, and capabilities around it, and then access to production data so they can do the training that they need to do, and they can really access it to build stuff that's very transportable onto the production side. Because at the end of the day, that's the bigger challenge, is transporting it. I will add, though, that definitely a big, over the last 8 months, our focus very much has been on actually modernizing the infrastructure to be ready to even do this, right? So, you know, we don't only have 1 gig lines in our building anymore, you know, stuff like when the internet's faster at my house than where I work, that's a problem, right? So we fixed that problem, right? So the Navy guys laugh because the internet where they're at is bad, real bad. Can't develop on that. But there's still, part of this is kind of that journey to actually do that modernization.
So a year from now, we'll ask for an update. So.
No problem.
All right.
I got cool stuff going on. All right.
What else?
No other questions?
Package management. How do you guys secure all the data science?
Ooh, one of my favorite topics. Third-party libraries and stuff. Awesome. Yeah. So it's a great question. I will tell you that is probably the most challenging space right now. These guys will tell you, and here's my no joke, honest answer. However you've looked at cybersecurity and information assurance, yeah, erase all that, right? You actually need people with some serious skills to be in there to triage kind of the reports you get from a lot of these tools. I think the other thing is you need to have whoever owns the risk needs to be intimately involved with the process. I understand that that's hard everywhere. For the federal folks and the folks in DoD, you know what that means. How many times have you seen your AO sit down and read source code? That many times, right? I do have to do that a lot, and you really have to have that right skill set to do that. Because, and I'll give you an example, because we had one not too long ago. I get everybody in a panic. Oh, this thing has this strong vulnerability, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, great. Is any of the code pointing at it? No. Are we using it for anything? No. Is it active to link to anything? No. Why do you care? Move on, right? Like, you know, but somebody had to physically go in there and triage that. The harder problem, the much harder problem, is old, not supported libraries that are still out there, and making that fundamental decision on whether or not you want to take your time and effort and invest it in upgrading something that's not supported. I think that's where we need a lot of help from the open source community. I think that's one of our biggest challenges in the federal space, and what scares a lot of organizations off on the open source side is it is a hard case to make to the federal government that they're going to take some half-baked unsupported code and invest dollars into making that work, right? That's kind of backwards from what the intent is supposed to be. But a lot of it is that triage, right? I will tell you that from a DevOps perspective, we have pretty set thresholds. They're app dependent, right? So each app looks different. 100 lines of code versus 1,000 lines of code, which I'm being small here. There's a difference on how you triage that and put red lines as it goes through the tools. But that's a very, cybersecurity has to be all in from the beginning on that development.
Stack. I mean, you guys
Oh.
building Stack. How do you know that their code is legit?
Well, How do you know Microsoft's code is legit? Right? I mean, right, so we take risks, right? So look, as a guy who owns a bunch of networks and is ultimately responsible for if something bad happens, right? I have a risk threshold. I will tell you what the delta is. Microsoft, Hortonworks, all these companies, right? They're spending a lot of time and effort making sure that their product is secure, right? Because they don't want to lose customers like me. So the risk tolerance is a little bit smaller there. Yeah. So those are right, and they're hard.
Yeah.
They're hard, and you got to make a decision. Yeah, like what you can do though. So what we do on a lot of this stuff, and it gets really interesting, especially when we're trying to go real fast, and there's something that's bleeding edge, and it's got a community, but it's you know. I do spend some time and make sure that we put extra taps on there and extra monitoring, right, to mitigate that risk. But at the end of the day, it's mission need. Look, if your boss comes and says, we need this now, or somebody's going to die, or somebody's not going to know that this bad thing is going to happen, you take risk, right?
Yeah. Definitely a defense in depth strategy. Yeah. Guys, we are out of time, and we are getting the Crookshank thing. So if you guys have any other questions, please come talk to us afterwards. Thank you for being here. Really enjoyed speaking. Thanks, man.
Oh, no problem, man.